Hello, and a warm welcome to the last of this edition of our Tax for Growth monthly webinar series. We'll get started in just a few minutes. The speakers will hold a live Q&A in the last 20 minutes of the lecture. So if you wish to submit a question, please use the Q&A function. You can upload a question by clicking the thumbs up icon. All materials such as lecture slides and recordings will be available after the webinar on our website. We'll get started in just a few minutes. I'll maybe give it one more minute and then we can get started. Okay, I think I'll get started. Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining the sixth and final webinar in our Tax Talk series. My name is Shigoto Mitra, and I'm a policy economist in the Tax for Growth initiative at the International Growth Center. I'll be chairing today's discussion, focusing on the profit shifting of multinational enterprises operating in the extractives industry, focusing on oil, gas, and mining. Extractive sectors often see surges in commodity prices translate into windfall profits that end up booked and largely untaxed in low-tax jurisdictions, depriving resource-rich low and middle-income countries of vital revenue. Today's discussion will explore why these profit shifts matter, how governments can redesign tax and contract structures, leverage emerging technologies, and collaborate across borders to ensure windfalls fuel sustainable development. To teach us something about profit shifting in the extractive sector, we're privileged to be joined today by Dr. Ninon Moho-Kassler, a postdoc researcher at the EU Tax Observatory in the Paris School of Economics. We have Dr. Pierre Bachas, an economist with the World Bank Development Research Group. And we have Dr. Ekpen Omonbude, a senior policy advisor with the International Institute of Sustainable Development's Economic Law and Policy Program, working with the Intergovernmental Forum on Mining, Minerals, Metals, and Sustainable Development. We'll get started with a brief framing presentation by Dr. Ninon, and we'll then have a panel discussion with Ninon, Pierre, and Ekpen, and this will be followed by 20 minutes of Q&A. Just before we get started, I want to run through some housekeeping items. So if anyone would want to act as a live participant during the webinar, meaning you'll have access to mic and video and can interact verbally during the Q&A, please virtually raise your hand and Greg will randomly select a few of you to join the discussion. For other participants, please type any questions you have in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screens. We'd like to encourage you to submit them at any point during the discussion. And if you could include your name and organizational affiliation when you write your questions, that would be fantastic. You can also upload a question by clicking the thumbs up icon. I'd like to note that we're recording all lectures in the series, and the recordings will be made available on IGC's website. And final point from me, there'll be a brief survey immediately following today's webinar. So please do take a minute to fill that out, as your feedback is very important to us. Without further ado, over to Ninon to lead off with the presentation.
Thank you. Just sharing my screen. Can you see it well?
Yes, we can see your screen.
Okay. Perfect. Thanks a lot. And thanks also to the full IGC Tax for Growth initiative for setting up this webinar series. I'm very happy to give this presentation on the global allocation of extractive windfalls. And this is based on work done with Alice Chiocchetti, who's a PhD student at Paris School of Economics. So in the next decade, expecting to see large increase in mining, oil and gas prices. Those increases could be driven by, for example, the commodity boom linked to the green transition and the need for transition mineral, by increased energy demand, or by geopolitical shocks as we've witnessed in the recent years. And so those price increases are going to generate revenues that we usually call extractive windfalls. And those revenues, for extractive sectors, they tend to represent a major source of fiscal revenues in many countries. For example, in DRC, it's around 46%. It's also very high in Angola and Nigeria. And those extractive windfalls, they are shared between those countries and with the actors that undertake the extraction, the production of those commodities. Those actors, they are often multinational groups that represent a large share of global production. And those multinational groups, as their name indicates, they operate and locate profits and revenues in multiple countries, but also in several sectors. Often those groups, such as Total or Glencore, tend to be also integrated vertically from extraction to sale. So when there is a price increase, when there is a windfall, the allocation of this windfall is going to represent the real activity, the extraction, but also the profitability of those downstream sector. But it could also be driven by tax optimization. A lot of anecdotal evidence of MNEs that could have implemented schemes of profit shifting in order to avoid taxes. And there is a lot of literature also in public finance showing that this type of scheme is quite sizable among MNEs. So the crucial question then for extractive states is to know whether those rent sharing, when you have windfalls, could be affected by profit shifting. So we've been interested in how extractive windfalls are located along the geography of those big multinational groups and how it affects the repartition of taxes and windfalls across states. So what we do is that we will do in this presentation is first look at the MNEs and how they allocate windfalls across their affiliates, where there is a change in the price of the main commodity that they extract. And second, also, I will discuss on how, when you have this price increase, the tax payment at the field or mine level reacts also. To a few stylus facts just to present to you a bit more this background of those extractive sector. So this first graph here is showing you that indeed the activity of foreign MNEs is very prevalent in extractive states. So in orange, you see the share of the volume of oil and gas production or the total number of mines in the lower panel that are extracted by foreign MNEs. And you see that in many countries, per country, and in many countries, this share is very high, meaning that those states really rely on those actors for extraction. And in those states, MNEs tend to face a different tax regime than other sectors, which translates, if we look at the group level, effective tax rate than in other sectors. You see in black the series across time for oil MNEs derived from CompuStat Global, and in orange for mining MNEs. And those effective tax rates have not seen the same trend as the other sectors. And this is because of those specific tax instruments also that seek to compensate for the depletion of a non-renewable resource for those extractive states. Now, those revenues for MNEs and fiscal revenues in place for extractive states, they are subject to a lot of volatility due to the fact that they depend a lot on the global price of the commodity extracted. On this graph, you see the time variation of the price index for the main extractive commodities across time. And you see that there has been a large commodity boom before 2015, but also that there are very different levels of volatility across commodities that are going to drive the extractive windfalls, both for firms and states. Now, to study how those prices generate windfalls that are not then allocated through different actors, what we do is that we use very novel sources of data that are available actually through the new transparency obligations that exist for extractive M&Es. The first one, which is not specific to the extractive sector, are the country-by-country reports. Since a few years now, the largest M&Es above the 750 million threshold in revenues, they have to provide exhaustive information on profit, sales, and different financial variables to a lot of jurisdiction where they have an active subsidiary. And this allows us actually to track for 73 oil, gas, and mining groups their allocation of profit across all of the countries in which they are active from 2016 to 2023. Now, the second set of very valuable information that is new and generated by new transparency obligation for those firms are the project-by-project reports. Since 2015, extractive firms that are listed in the EU, Canada, Norway, and the UK, they have to provide information and publicly report, this is mandatory, information on the payment that they make to government that is linked to extractive activity. And this payment has to be disclosed by project, so by mine or by oil field, and by type of tax, so corporate income tax. It could be also royalties or any type of bonus or fees that is implemented by the extractive tax regime. And we complement this data with data on oil and gas and mining production to be able to really track where is the M&E extractive activity happening and what is the main commodity extracted by a group. So with this data at hand, we document new facts. This first graph shows you the effective income tax rate across countries where those 73 extractive M&Es are active. And in orange, you see countries where M&Es have an extractive activity, at least one M&E has an extractive activity. And in black, you see the countries that are classified as tax haven. And you see that in extractive countries, ETRs tend to be higher than in the rest of the world in blue. But in tax haven, where you have also a very high profit to employee ratio that is shown in the y-axis, there is a very low at the same time ETR. Well, those tax havens, they tend to represent a large part of profits and sales for those 73 extractive M&Es, between 14 and 22%. At the same time, they represent a rather low share of employees and tangible assets that are often used as indicator of real activity. And in those tax havens, affiliates of those extractive groups tend to focus more on insurance, finance, or shareholding activity compared to the rest of the group. And tax havens, affiliates in tax haven are a lower share of affiliates that are more specialized in real production activity. To study windfalls at the M&E level, what we do is that we identify what is for each of those groups the main commodity that is extracted on the period prior to the one that we study. So, for example, groups that are more specialized in copper production or in oil or gas. And we see actually in the paper that when there is an increase in the price of this commodity, this translates into a large increase in consolidated, so group level profit and sales. And in the second step, we look at this increase of consolidated profit and sales. How is it distributed then within the group? And what we do is, of course, we compare M&E that are affected by different commodities due to their specialization. But within those, we are going to compare the affiliates that are specialized in extractive or that are located in tax haven, for example, to the rest of the affiliates that are non-extractive and not in tax haven in the group. And this is kind of a triple difference strategy that we estimate with the following equation. And the result of the following, this is the main goal of this research. We have first, in the first column, this coefficient that shows us that when there is an increase in the price of the commodity in which the group is specialized, of course, on average, the profit of all affiliates increases significantly. But if we decompose between the types of affiliates, we see that affiliates that are located in tax havens, they tend to react more than the rest of the group. And their price elasticity, so the percentage change to a 1% increase in the price of one commodity, is higher than in the rest of the group by 0.5 to 0.7 percentage point. Now, we also look in the very unstructured way just to which are the countries where you see this higher increase in booked profit when there is an increase in the price of the commodity extracted by the group. And you see that in orange, it tends to be extractive countries that react a lot, countries where there is some extraction taking place. But in black, you see also that tax havens tend to react a lot to those increase in commodity price in terms of booked profits. And lastly, we also look at what those commodity price imply in terms of fiscal windfalls, so the increase in fiscal revenues for states where there is extraction. What we find is that when there is a 1% price increase, the increase in fiscal revenues tend to be higher for mines than for oil and gas fields. It tends to come from types of instruments that are based on production or revenues compared to other types of instruments. And a result also that we show in this paper is that countries that tend to have a good state capacity tend to have a higher price elasticity of their fiscal revenues, meaning that countries with a good state capacity tend to adjust more their fiscal revenues to price increase and price decreases than countries with a lower state capacity. And this could be either the sign of profit shifting, but could be also the result of a choice of those countries in the way they design their tax regime to capture those extractive windfalls. So I'll sum up here on this conclusion slide, recapping all of the results that I've presented, and I'm very happy to start this discussion on the taxation of extractive windfalls.
Thank you so much, Ninon. That was a fantastic presentation, and I think it really just set the scene for us beautifully for the rest of this discussion. So thank you so much. I guess the first thing that I wanted to talk about was something that you did mention and go into some detail during the paper and in your presentation as well. But if you could just kind of recap a little bit for us in the audience, what the real world impact of these profits being shifted, and what's the real world impact if they're not taxed where the resources are effectively extracted?
Mm-hmm. So those windfalls tend to be defined as basically increases in revenues or profit that are generated by price changes and not linked to the productivity of the mine or more economic determinant of the project itself. Those are shocks at the global level. And those windfalls, it's important for states to tax some of it, but they tend also to reward the investor and the mine operator for the risk of this type of project. At the same time, if windfalls are not taxed where extraction is undertaken, I think there is a first consequences is that those extraction states, they have very specific tax regimes that try to capture those windfalls that are not tend not to exist in countries where you do not have extraction, where those windfalls then will face another tax regime. So this is they will be less than taxed by states. And the second consequences would be a more obvious one is that it depletes states for resources that should compensate for the fact that those products are now extracted and you cannot recover them. Those are non-renewable resources. And windfalls could pay for many things, so the depletion of the resource, but outside of that, also finance development, infrastructure, public investment, and so on. And it could also compensate for the fact that actually extractive activity tends also to be damaging for the local environment and with everything that is constructed for the mine. Of course, the firms usually they have to leave everything as they found it, but there are still some consequences that you cannot really compensate for, and this is why those revenues tend to be important.
Thank you so much, Ninon. I think that really clearly explains why it's so relevant and why we're talking about this issue. I wanted to maybe turn to Pierre next. Just to say, the paper estimates that a 1% rise in commodity prices leads to an increase of 0.7% excess profit in tax havens. Are you able to help us understand the scale of that? Like, what does that imply in terms of dollar terms for a typical low and middle income country? How does that lost revenue compare to budgets for health, education, infrastructure?
Thank you, Sogara. So this is quite a tough question. Maybe we'll see if Nino wants to add something. So there's a result in the paper that first is very important, is that the price elasticity of global profits of this multinational is quite sensitive. It's around 1.6, meaning when the price of commodities goes up, multinationals gain in their total profit. Okay, so no one will be particularly surprised by that. They gain up faster though, more than 1-for-1, right? So they become particularly profitable when prices go up. Okay. The second result that finds in the paper is that when the price increases, the whole group gains, but the subsidiaries in tax havens gains even more relative to the rest of them, right? So it's important to understand that her paper is really about a derivative type of results, right? So it's not very easy to interpret this in terms of dollars, because I think you need to know the baseline tax avoidance that was already going on. But what we learn, which I think is really important in terms of booms, there's actually extra revenue loss in levels, right? So you lose more in absolute levels. Now, I think what's interesting is more what that means for tax authority rather than really precise amounts, which is it's a time when the tax authorities are probably feeling pretty good. They're actually on net, they're still gaining revenue in levels, right? So it's probably potentially the same time where their compliance efforts might be a bit weaker. But in papers show that's precisely when firms accelerate, if you want, the degree of profit shifting. And so I think, it's a bit of a counterintuitive lesson we learned from that. That's at the time of booms that really any compliance effort should be doubled down and not the opposite, right? And so that's something, that probably we need a real case study in a country. And Nino has thought a little bit about this to go at this next step, right? How does the compliance game interact with the price of commodities?
Yeah, I think that's a fascinating intervention, Pierre, and thank you for mentioning that. I don't know, Nino, if you have any responses or if you're happy for me to go on to Ekpen and hear his thoughts.
No, thank you, Pierre. You did a great job at summarizing that indeed those evolution have to be interpreted as relative to the rest of the group that does not do extraction as those affiliates in tax haven, indeed.
So now I wanted to kind of shift gears a little bit and ask Ekpen about some examples of profit shifting mechanisms during booms. So how does that actually work in practice? And let's say you're in the shoes of a policymaker in a low and middle income country. What would you be on the lookout for? What tools would you have available?
Thanks. And let me start off by saying thanks to the IGC for inviting me to come and rant briefly here. Well done to Nino for putting a very fascinating paper together, and I look forward to getting in touch to have further discussions outside of this. And also to Pierre for the way you've just given that nuance in terms of that counterintuitive dynamic that tends to happen in these sorts of things. But to your question, Secretary, in terms of mechanisms, that you could look out for. There are a few. So I start off from the broad, simplistic, as practical as possible way to look at it. What are we trying to identify here? Situations or scenarios where the costs profile increases in order to reduce the base from which taxes will be taken, or the other way around, where the revenue profile is reduced in order to reduce the opportunity for taxes. What are we looking at in this case? To narrow it down to Ninon's paper, it's essentially the relationship that these international organizations have with their affiliates and the extent to which there's transfer pricing opportunities. So that's one of the first common tools that we tend to look at, transfer pricing and manipulation. What we're asking here is, are there any unusual or artificial inflations to costs for things like services, for equipment, or for financing that's provided between these related parties? So you want to check for that. Another opportunity or another mechanism rather is the treatment of debt between these entities. What's the interest rate at which it's being charged? In fact, I don't know how much time I have, but I'll quickly share one war story. I think war story in the sense that I fought it vicariously. I had nothing to do with it. It was far away from me, but it's publicly available now, and it's an interesting case to look at. Chevron, Australia. The short of it is one of the US affiliates takes a loan out at a 1.2% interest rate and then gives a loan to Chevron Australia at a 9% interest rate. Trouble with these things is that they're like plane crashes. So you only tend to find out when you're doing the audits to figure out what's happened. And it's in the audit process that the Australian Tax Office gets to ask the question, well, hang on a minute, what are the prices between these affiliates? So the interest rates from the parent company and then the interest rate that was given to the subsidiary affiliate. What's the danger in that? That interest rate is deductible, it's recoverable in Australia. So that's a potential loss of revenue, which interestingly ties to the questions that you asked earlier in terms of trying to put a number to these things. It's difficult to do. But from this particular exercise, the Australian Tax Office won the case for 340 million, I think it's Australian dollars, which when you put into context of things that they could have done in education, in healthcare, and in infrastructure, is a significant chunk of money. So we tend to look for those kinds of things. Other things to look at, the establishment of marketing hubs. So is there, as in Ninon's paper, is there an increase in the establishment of subsidiaries in specific locations? Switzerland comes to mind, or Singapore comes to mind. So you look out for those. Another one to look out for is intellectual property. So oil, gas mining, there's a fair bit of exploration data that's used, extraction technologies. So the question we're asking now is, where is that intellectual property being sort of domiciled? And they're asking questions about, are there treaty relationships between the countries involved? Are there advantages that are being taken as a result of those treaty relationships? So those kinds of, I'd use those for. There were other questions you asked. I think you touched on, was it red flags for policymakers? What kinds of things do we look out for? Well, I mentioned one earlier. The obvious one is there a significant increase in costs as a result of, say, maybe intercompany service fees during these price booms? And then there's the Chevron example, the changes in interest rates. And then on the flip side, if there are sales being made, say, to a marketing hub or to another affiliate company, what was the price at which it was sold? Is it lower than what would have been the case if there were unrelated parties? And then, yeah, as I mentioned earlier, the sudden establishment of new subsidiaries in tax havens or in low tax jurisdiction. Tools. Nino mentioned one in the report, and I thought that was very useful, actually, the country by country reporting. It's useful to, when you require multinational companies to have a disclosure of profits and taxes by jurisdiction. That's one. And then the rules that tend to normally be applied in various tax administrations. So it's not so much a tax policy thing now, but a tax administration instruments. So transfer pricing rules, thin capitalization rules, general anti-avoidance rules. But even beyond that are and this is an opportunity to do some shameless plugging of some of the work that we do at the IISD. Even beyond that is getting those rules to work, sort of building manuals that tend to apply those. And for that, we tend to put together a number of we call them practice notes, where we're asking these sorts of questions that, okay, how do you apply these rules? Or in the area where there are no rules, can we make some adaptations to what exists? One of such ones is on mineral valuation and transfer pricing. Here we're asking that question about what price is it that companies are selling to their affiliates, and how does that apply to specific minerals, because it will vary from mineral to mineral. So for that, we've published one on bauxite, we've done one on lithium, we've just put one out now for public consultation on copper. I'll stop there.
Fantastic, Ekman. Thank you so much for the war story, firstly, and for also bringing it down to reality, looking at the mechanisms by which profit shifting actually happens. And I think you mentioned a little bit about the how this kind of works internationally, and I think that's a perfect seg to our next sort of section on international rules and maybe ideas of equity or fairness. And my first question is going to be to Ninon. Recent global rules such as the OECD, BEPS Inclusive Framework, they aim to curb profit shifting. But how might these interact with extractives windfalls, and could they potentially unintentionally redirect profits to other niches?
Thanks. Yeah, I think it's a very important question. I think in the design of those rules, this question of extractive windfalls was maybe a bit forgotten. In the first, so pillar one, in the first pillar, where you had to there was this mechanism to redistribute some supplementary profit to market countries or jurisdiction. The extractive industries were completely actually removed from this pillar one because it appeared clear to everyone that they should be taxed in the country of extraction where this real activity was taking place. So they were not included in that. For Pillar 2, actually, which implements this minimum tax and top-up tax that can be recovered in many jurisdictions according to an order of priority, actually, this Pillar 2 might not generate so much revenues for extractive states because, as we saw in the presentation, ETRs in those countries tend to be already quite high. So there will not be a big difference. So they will tend to be higher than this 15% minimum tax. Then other profits could be taxed in other jurisdictions. So for example, in tax havens, if they choose to do so, or in the headquarter countries, we tend to be not developing extractive states in general. So I think that in terms of mechanical revenues that Pillar 2 would create, it would be rather low for extractive states. In terms of maybe behavioral responses of firms, we don't know yet, but this would be maybe more of a response than those mechanical revenue created by Pillar 2. And then if we think about like maybe the guilty framework, the US one that we have in mind, this one is based on the ETR at the group level. And therefore, we've seen already in the presentation that this type of groups tend to have consolidated ETRs that are quite high already, and that this would not trigger the collection of top-up tax in this case. So I think that the question for extraction country is more this question of windfalls and how do you get those supplementary revenues. And yeah, I hope that maybe in other setups for negotiation about international taxation, this topic could be discussed a bit more.
Thank you, Neda. I think that really perfectly kind of frames that discussion at the international level. Before I Before I ask further questions of Ikpen and Pierre, just wanted to check if either of you wanted to add anything further to Ninon's answer.
Not in particular, other than just to echo everything she said, but also, again, maybe just using this opportunity to plug one of the questions that we're also trying to ask. It's not so much the concern, as Ninon rightly put, because of the effective tax rates that you typically get for these kinds of operations, that the minimum tax becomes an issue. When it gets very interesting is in things like, for instance, what kinds of behavioral responses would the companies have in, I'll give one example, the transfer of rights, shares offshore. Where's that going to happen? What jurisdiction is that going to take place? What rules are going to apply in those jurisdictions? How are you treating permanent establishments? How are they treating treaties, etc.? So it's in those kinds of behavioral responses that I guess we're yet to see how it'll play out.
And I guess while I have you then, Ekpen, I'm just going to address a question to you. So when countries are negotiating mining and oil agreements, stabilization clauses often lock in tax regimes for quite a long time. How can governments design these clauses to allow windfall responsive tax adjustments when prices surge?
Interesting one. I guess I should start off by saying that all of the opinions expressed in here are mine and not necessarily representative of the organization that I work for. But one of the things that we tend to say is first avoid, if you can, getting yourself locked into these stabilization agreements. And in the event that you can't avoid it, aggressively protect yourself. And how do you do so? There are a number of ways to achieve this, but the key message here is, I guess, these clauses do not need to be absolute barriers to windfall taxation. It all depends essentially on how they're designed, and what are the ways or considerations in here. You could think of partial stabilization, where you're looking to sort of protect the core tax rates while preserving the rights to adjust the levies as you go on. You could look at it in terms of price triggered adjustments, or you could look at it in terms of profit based triggers. The aim here being to ensure that the fiscal and taxation system responds almost automatically to changes in profitability. And sort of does two ways, or works to capture both ways. Profitability as a result of a reduction in costs tends not to happen a lot in reality, or profitability as a result of increasing in prices, but to be able to respond automatically to those. So you sort of want to structure it in such a way that it doesn't necessarily hamstring you, the resource country, in terms of your sovereign right to change taxes, but at the same time also recognizes the volatility and risk that comes with these sorts of operations. It's not a what's the word I'm looking for here now? There's no hard and fast rule that applies to all of it, and there are times where even with stabilization clauses in place, circumstances change so dramatically that you've got to come out of it. One example that I can think of off the top of my head, but I can't remember if there was a stabilization clause in there. It probably wasn't, but it's useful nonetheless, was when nickel prices collapsed completely. I think it was early last year. The nickel operators sat down with one of the Australian governments, I forget which of the states, and they came to an agreement to just have a moratorium on production. Things were that bad, so that steps outside of these sort of mechanisms. But yes, I guess the message here is to always question the role of what you're trying to stabilize. What are you really trying to fulfill here? And what are the provisions trying to sort out? The other point I guess I'll try and make here is to define as clearly as possible what the criteria for windfall situations would be in those sort of clauses, and establish as clearly as possible the calculation methodologies well in advance. then of course for the lawyers, is always include dispute resolution provisions in there, just in case things go spectacularly wrong.
Thank you so much, Ekpen. I think that was a wonderful answer. I'm conscious that we're quickly running out of time and we are planning on going to the Q&A section soon. But before we do, I just wanted to ask a few final questions of our panelists, kind of turning to areas of collaboration and potential areas of future research. So first, maybe I'll go to Pierre. Just to say that many low and middle income tax agencies lack in-house modeling units. So I wanted to check with you, like, what's the most cost-effective way that international organizations like the World Bank, the EU Tax Observatory, or IISD can help build local analytic capacity? Would it be things like data tools, fellowship programs, embedded technical teams? I'm just curious to get your take.
Thanks. I mean, this is a really important question, and I think what's nice is we're starting to see great work supported, by the UN, the World Bank, the IGC, and others. And that's my personal opinion, but I think investment in countries' data capacity is really one of the highest returns we can do as researchers. And what's nice that compared to a few years ago, we really start to see some successful stories and models. And so there doesn't need to be one size fits all. A lot of you might know, for example, how South Africa has really created an amazing data lab where people can apply with project. It started with the tax administration, but it's becoming slowly a whole of government approach, and so, really state of the art, and we knew that Denmark could do that, but we hadn't seen, I would say, other non-Scandinavian countries do that so well, right? So that's really one example, but a country doesn't need to go there. There's many other models. Some that are more modest start with maybe a policy team within the tax administration that takes a key role. One thing is really how to make those sustainable, because we've seen, efforts start and then they get discontinued. And I think, that there's two things I've learned in my effort, for example, working with the Honduras tax administration. One is to show to the tax administration that there's really good returns and quite quickly from this type of, data and so on. And one easy win is, for example, risk management, compliance risk, right? And often with a good data and economics team, you can already show result. Another one is things like nowcasting. We're getting so much data, I think e-invoicing and so on, that things that would take sometimes a year, like GDP prices and so on, you can now do cheaply at a much faster pace, right? So those are really wins. I think we're going to see the adoption. The question is, can we help facilitate that? The other thing that these teams can do is also show that they're very useful to other areas of government, things central bank, labor ministries, and so on, right? And so I think that's how we can help, also preparing a bit of a roadmap, not just how to start them, but how can they show value so that countries want to keep them on. I wanted to add one thing. You had another question. We're running out of time, but what's one great question that this team should study? I think if you have a policy team, a data lab, linked to the question that Ninon is studying, and it's more the real effect. So we've talked a lot about compliance today. Compliance is really important. That's what's going to matter for revenue, but we know much less about real effect, both on the investment side, what makes some projects start, what are the fixed costs and so on. Very difficult to measure in these long-term extractive type of projects. And maybe even more interestingly, for the countries, the receiving country, what can they do to start bringing value added to the process, right? And so many countries have things like local content requirements, technology transfers. These are very poorly evaluated. My sense is in a lot of cases, they don't work so well because, firms are really ticking boxes and saying, well, we've created X new employees, local employees, but maybe they're not doing any of the real knowledge creation or skill transfer. And that's really, I think, a fascinating area because it's not just about getting the revenue. I think in the medium term, what you really want is starting to get some of the capacity, right? And so my sense is we know very little about this. And so that would be a very interesting project, specifically if you could collaborate with some of these policy units, the tax administration or national statistics office.
That's a really interesting answer, Pierre. And not to put you on the spot, Ninon, but if you could launch one new study on, extractive windfalls, what would it be? And what would it be and why would you do it?
Well, connected to what has been said already, I think it would be super interesting to focus maybe on the implementation of an excess profit tax and see indeed what are the effects in terms of revenues, compliance, but also real effect. As Pierre was saying, this would be very interesting indeed.
Excellent. My final question before we do go to the Q&A is for Ekpen. And I wanted to ask you, are there any standout examples in your mind where resource-rich, low and middle income countries have successfully shared lessons on capturing extractive windfalls? And how can these networks be scaled up?
A tricky question. Tricky in the sense that if you look at in terms of how you define where success is, right? So I'm gonna lazily define success at the point of interaction, that these conversations are happening, and they are very much so at regional level. So the organization, the body, CIAT, I forget the acronym, but it's for the tax administrators in Latin America. So the Inter-American Tax Administrators Group, where you have countries like Chile, Peru, and Colombia in some instances sharing their experiences of how these things are handled and treated. Another example I can give is the Africa Tax Administrative Forum as well. Where in addition to sharing these kinds of experiences, they also try and keep things as practical as possible. They were speaking the last time about the opportunity, I don't know how far they've gone with this. One of the challenges that many of these tax policymakers and administrators face, and I think Nina mentions it, if not in her paper in the presentation, is access to data and the cost of it, right? So one of the things that they're trying to do is to get some sort of combined access to particularly transfer pricing databases, where a lot of this information sometimes is behind paywalls that for one reason or the other, maybe it's not included in budgets for the year. Simple practical things like that. We tend to have a sort of practical bias to some of these solutions. But yes, so those are the kinds of examples that where we see sort of for want of a better expression, shining lights. In terms of scaling, technical assistance exchanges would help. Joint research, as Pierre hinted at. Matter of fact, I'm going to be touching base with you now after this exercise to explore, because we do some collaborative effort with those organizations that I mentioned, ATAF, CIAT. We also do work with the OECD. And we're in a cycle at the moment now of trying to think of what kinds of research questions we want to be asking in the next 2-3 years. So now would be a good time to start testing out some of these conversations. But again, back to the practical side, we've mentioned that sort of interagency collaboration. But one of the things that tends to not happen a lot, but we're starting to see it happen in certain cases, Zimbabwe is a good example of what's being tried out, is where you get people who have specific skills to the industry to sit in tax policy planning and auditing functions. So geologists, geophysicists, engineers, etc., who know exactly what should be in a field development plan for oil and gas or a feasibility study for mining. And they're able to then use that kind of information to be able to flag better what the possibilities are for specific changes to costs and specific changes to prices. I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Ekpen. Thank you to all of our panelists. This has been, I could keep asking you guys questions, but I think we're running out of time. I just wanted to move briefly on to the Q&A, and I'll just pose a few questions to all of you, and whoever wants to take it can answer. So the first question that we have from our Q&A is from Laura. She says, thank you all for your thoughts and participation. I wanted to ask how a CBAM might impact extractive profits from extractive industries. So that's the carbon border adjustment mechanism that the EU has just put in place. So open to the floor. I'm happy for any of you to, if you have an answer for that.
Maybe I can start to answer. So CBAM is going to. So we actually started some work at the EU Tax Observatory on CBAM, and we've been interested in this question. CBAM is actually targeting two mineral sectors in particular. So for iron and steel and aluminum, the other metals are for now excluded from CBAM. And this is something we are very much interested in terms of first, I think the first relevant step would be what is the effect of CBAM in terms of trade flow and reallocation and so on, of exchanges of those products. So this is actually a question we're investigating in the case of South Africa with the data lab there to understand how those firms that are exporting aluminum, iron, and steel to the EU redirect or not their exports, and the magnitude of this adjustment. In terms of the other metals, if CBAM was expanded, I don't know, but I think it's a super relevant area to think about, like how tax, not only CBAM but also taxation might interact also with some environment outcomes such as carbon emission and so on, and this is something super relevant to think about.
Thank you so much, Ninon. Maybe I will go on to the next question, which is from Tuiwei. She asks, how reliable and complete are the country-by-country reports in the extractive sector?
So I can also answer this one since I've worked with this data in this case. So we worked with country-by-country reports. Firms can either transmit the information to tax administration, and in this case, it's not public, or you have some firms and some extractive groups that publicly disclose their CBCR reports. Actually, the EU Tax Observatory does a great work at collecting those public reports, harmonizing and providing them in a harmonized database. If you want to take a look at it. From what we saw, actually, those firms that are publicly disclosing their country-by-country report, they have some how do I say that? Some they can like aggregate a bit more if they want the level of information, and we've seen that some are very good quality, super transparent, and so on. And in some cases, the quality is a bit uneven. For example, you have a lot of tax havens jurisdiction that are pulled together with other ones as a big like other category. So there is still like some room for the group to publicly report at the level at which they want. And not all CBCR reports are public for now. It's a choice made by the firm, of course, to make it public.
Yeah, I'll just add to that it's a good starting point. Like pretty much everything else in this field, it could do with some refinements, some improvements, but it is also no substitute for using other sources or methods to check. And I just want to highlight the point that Ninon made, that most of these companies, because of the size, the typical sizes of their operations and their international status and locations and jurisdictions, etc., would tend to almost always raise capital somewhere publicly. And because they have to do that, they have to make certain submissions, which will be available by requirements of one of those stock exchanges. So another way to also look at it is to go in individually in cases where the information is grainy and not complete. You can get the submissions from there as well.
Yeah, and I just wanted to add that indeed to stress this point, CBCRs are a big improvement indeed for countries, especially for extraction states that cannot observe the full value added chain of those minerals, and this is something that you could not observe before having this instrument.
Yeah.
Excellent. So they're a big improvement from what was there before, but of course, like anything, they could be improved further. Okay, that's super interesting. Another question. Let me direct this one to Pierre potentially. So from Zorka, they say, how do these issues of extractives profit shifting compare between developing and developed producer countries? In other words, are resource-rich countries like US, Australia doing better in stopping profit shifting than countries in Africa and Latin America?
It's a good question, right? I mean, there's a few angles to them. One, which, in terms of data, it connects to the previous question, that the US is often a bit black hole on many of these things. And I'm wondering, so, the US was not participating, I believe, right, in those CBCR voluntary or mandatory reports. Is that right?
We have a few, not on the voluntary, but on the one we accessed through administrative data, we have a few American firms.
But the more general question is, are richer countries doing better in terms of, fighting transfer pricing and so on? It's not obvious that they necessarily are, because like many things in tax compliance, it's a bit of a race, and you get these really powerful companies that, even compared to the IRS in the US or the Revenue Authority in Australia, have many more lawyers, can get kind of top talent. And so my sense is that it is similarly, they're similarly overmatched. What they have been a bit more active is kind of passing rules that maybe limit some of the worst abuses, and I'll mention two things. We already talked about guilty in the US, which is one tentative of limiting very low profit reports in the US. Another one that I've heard is becoming much more common is what they call advanced transfer pricing agreements, or advanced pricing agreements, right? With the idea that often both the taxpayer and the administration care about some certainty, right? So the taxpayer, they want to know they won't face sudden audit, or sudden changes to tax policy. The tax administration is happy to have some kind of continuity in their revenue collection, right? And so colleagues at the EU Tax Observatory are working on that in France, and there's been a big uptick in this, right? I think what's important is that all of these solutions are kind of patches on a problem that is not really getting fixed, right? So one again can see, the glasses half full, saying there are solutions, or as half empty, which is we're not really dealing with the crux of the problem.
Thank you so much, Pierre. I think that's a really nuanced answer. Let me come to one final question, and I will kind of end the webinar after that. From Kiflu, could the stronger relationship between global prices and profits observed in the extractive sector be driven, at least in part, by the unique nature of the industry, where prices are closely tied to revenues and production costs are often fixed or locally incurred, rather than reflecting deliberate profit-shifting behavior? Have you done any robustness checks to rule this out? I think that's probably directed at me.
Yeah, indeed. So first, I wanted to give a bit more precision on some results. So the correlation that we find at the group level between prices and consolidated profit and sales, of course, we do not claim that this is something causal. It's more of a correlation between those commodity price and the revenues of those companies and so on. The way we tried to more causally identify something is to look at, okay, within the firm, the group, when we exclude anything that is doing any affiliate that is doing extraction, so that is very specific, or we have even tried some exercise where we remove also, for example, refining or transformation affiliates. If we compare two affiliates that are in the same sector, for example, in the insurance services sector, should we expect that there is a higher response of profits in the tax haven affiliates than in the one that is in a non-tax haven country? And that's how we try to approach as much as we can something that is a bit more causal and that we interpret as profit shifting. But yeah, so that would be my answer.
Excellent. I think we are unfortunately at time. and we do need to close the discussion. So firstly, a massive thank you to our speakers and also to our audience for your brilliant questions. A very quick reminder about the feedback survey. Please do take a minute to fill that out so we can continue improving our webinars. And all that's left to say is thank you so much for your attention, and we really look forward to seeing you again. Thank you. Take care.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.